Hi, um, thank you for watching or thank you for joining. So today we're going to be doing sex and gender as factors affecting status. This is Law of Persons. I'm happy that you joined, and I know that you will learn one or two things from this session. This is a very important session for those that are beginners in law, because this course is usually for first years, but it differs from one institution to the other. But this would be a foundation course um, to to build up your knowledge and understanding when it comes to law. So this is Law of Persons, sex and gender as factors affecting status. Okay, so this learning unit asks one main question. Can a person's sex or gender affect their legal position? Right? Can a person's sex or gender affect their legal position? The answer is yes, but only in limited and constitutionally acceptable ways. Um, our focus will be on the meaning of sex in law, situations where the law treats people differently because of sex, and transsexualism or gender reassignment, especially the effect of the Alteration of Sex Description and Status Act 49 of 2003. In simple terms, the law of persons is interested in whether a person has rights, duties, and capacities. You know, if you have already done age affecting, if you've already done age affecting capacity, you will know that a minor does not always have the same contractual capacity as an adult. And in this unit, we ask whether sex and gender can also affect legal status. Historically, the law often treated men and women differently. We already know that. For example, our older legal systems gave husbands more power in marriage, restricted women's property rights, and assumed women belonged in certain social roles. Uh, but the modern South African law rejects that approach because the Constitution protects equality, dignity, and freedom. The important starting point is Section 9 of the Constitution. It says everyone is equal before the law and has the right to equal protection and the benefit of the law. It also prohibits unfair discrimination on grounds including sex, gender, pregnancy, marital status, sexual orientation, and so on. So if a law treats people differently because they are male or female, transgender, pregnant, married or unmarried, we must ask whether that differentiation is fair or unfair. Um, Imagine a school says only boys may become class representatives. That is discrimination based on sex and gender. There is no good legal reasoning for it, and it attacks equality and dignity. But if a hospital has a maternity ward only for pregnant patients, that is differentiation based on biological reality. It is not automatically unfair. So the law does not, uh, it doesn't say all differentiation is illegal. It says unfair discrimination is illegal, right? So now, getting into the meaning of sex, okay, in the legal context. The first thing that you must understand is the difference between sex and gender. These terms are often used as if they mean the same thing, but legally and socially, they are not identical, right? So sex usually refers to biological characteristics, and these may include your reproductive organs, the chromosomes, the hormones, the physical characteristics, that would be your penis, your vagina, whatever. In everyday language, when a baby is born and the nurse says or the doctor says it's a boy or it's a girl, that is usually a sex classification based on visible biological characteristics, right? While gender, on the other hand, refers more to identity, social role, or personal self-understanding. Gender concerns how a person identifies and lives in the society. A person may be assigned male at birth, but identify and live as a woman. Another person may be assigned female at birth, but identify and live as a man. So, in simple terms, sex is usually biological, gender is connected to identity and social recognition, right? For beginners in law, sex is what the doctor records at birth, right? While gender is how the person understands and expresses themselves as a human being. The law used to be to focus almost completely, on the first one, right? While modern constitutional law cannot cannot ignore the second one, because dignity means the law must respect people's identity. For legal purposes, a person's sex is usually recorded at birth through the birth registration system, and that information appears on official documents such as the birth certificate, ID documents, you know. But modern law recognizes that this recorded sex description may later change, it may later be altered in certain circumstances under the Alteration of Sex Description and Sex Status Act 49 of 2003, right? So it's important that we understand the difference between before and now during our constitutional democracy, right? So when does the law treat people differently because of sex? So the law may sometimes treat people differently because of sex, but it must have legitimate reasons. The Constitution does not require blind sameness. It requires fairness. Sometimes treating everyone exactly the same would itself be unfair. For example, pregnancy is biologically connected to sex. If law gives maternity protection to pregnant employees, that is not unfair discrimination against men. It recognizes a real physical and social condition that requires protection. So if a pregnant employee needs time off for a childbirth, the employer cannot say we treat everyone equally, so no special leave. That would be formal equality, but not real equality. Okay? Real equality sometimes requires special protection. So another example is a separate male and female prison facilities. The law may separate people in prison for privacy, for safety, and bodily integrity, right? So that does not automatically mean it does not automatically mean unconstitutional discrimination. The purpose is not to degrade one's sex, it is to manage vulnerability and safety. But if law says women cannot own property, cannot sign contracts, or cannot work in certain professions simply because they are women, that would be unfair discrimination. It would be based on stereotypes, not real legal justification. So the key test is this: does the differentiation protect dignity and fairness, or does it reinforce prejudice and disadvantage? Right? So now let's get to transsexualism and gender reassignment. This is the most important part of this unit because it shows how South African law moved from an old biological approach to a new constitutional dignity-based approach, right? A transgender person is someone whose gender identity does not correspond with the sex assigned to them at birth. So some transgender persons undergo medical or surgical treatment, others may not. The law must decide whether and how that person's official sex description can be changed. This matters, okay? Just forgot to change this. Okay. Sorry about that. I forgot. I keep forgetting on changing these slides. See if I can put it on auto because when I talk, I don't look at the slides. Just bear with me. Am I gonna play this slide? Insert, draw, design, slideshow. Okay. Play. Okay, it will possibly play by itself, I think. Hopefully it will continue playing by itself. Sorry. This is it's a little bit distracting for me, but I hope that it will continue to play by itself. Okay. So let's continue. Where was I? We're talking about transgender. So a transgender person is someone whose gender identity does not correspond. Some transgender persons undergo medical or surgical treatment, others may not. The law must decide whether and how that person's official sex description can be changed, right? This matters because official documents affect real life. So a person's ID document is used for school, for university, employment, banking, you name it, marriage, voting, you know. So if a person lives as a woman, but her ID still records her as male, she may face humiliation, fraud suspicion, administrative problems, discrimination, and all. This is why gender recognition is not a small technical issue. It is linked to dignity, right? So then this takes us to the discussion of a very important case. It is the W versus W 1976 case, right? So in W versus W, the court dealt with the legal effect of sex reassignment in the context of marriage. The question the court had to deal with was whether a person who had undergone sex reassignment could be legally recognized as having changed sex for purposes of valid heterosexual marriage, right? So the court adopted a very strict biological approach. It treated sex as something fixed at birth. The court considered biological indicators such as chromosomes, gonads, genital characteristics. The effect was that surgical intervention did not legally change the person's sex for marriage purposes. In simple terms, the court said, even if the person has undergone surgery and lives socially as another sex, the law still looks at biological sex at birth. So when we read the textbook and they explain that the court followed the biological test and ignored the operative intervention, right? So the practical consequence was harsh. A person could live socially and physically in a reassigned sex, but the law could not, the law would still refuse to recognize that change. This created problems for marriage, ID documents, dignity, and social recognition, right? So imagine Thandi was assigned male at birth, but later transitions and lives as a woman. under the old approach in W versus W, the law could still treat Thandi as a man for marriage purposes. If she married a man, the law could say the marriage was invalid because legally, according to that old approach, it was not a marriage between a man and a woman. That shows how rigid and unfamiliar the old law could be, right? The criticism now of W versus W is that it reduced a person to simply biology. It didn't properly consider dignity, identity, psychological reality, or constitutional equality, right? Remember that this case was decided before the 96 Constitution and before the 2003 Act, right? So now, when the alteration of Sex Description and Sex Status Act 49 of 2003 came in, it changed that legal position. Its purpose is to allow certain persons to apply for alteration of their sex description. It also links to the Births and Deaths Registration Act so that official records can be updated. Academically, the discussions of the Act, they explain that it provides for alteration of sex description of certain individuals and consequential amendments to birth registration records. So in simple terms, the Act says if a person meets the legal requirements that the state, if a person meets the legal requirements, the state must recognize the altered sex description. So this means the person's official documents can be changed. This is important because legal status is not only about the abstract rights, it affects daily life. Your legal sex description may affect your ID, your employment records, your medical records, your how you interact with the government. So this course specifically requires that the effect of this act, on persons who have undergone sex reassignment surgery and the requirements for alteration of person's sex description in their birth certificate, right? So now, with that said, let's talk about another important case, the Goose case, the one that says Home Affairs must recognize gender change, the alteration of sex. So in Goose versus Goose or Goose, whatever way you want to pronounce it, versus the Minister of Home Affairs, this is now seen as a modern constitutional case where we must know and we must understand the difference between cause and W versus W, right? So in this case, the applicants were transgender persons who were married under the Marriage Act. After marriage, they underwent medical and surgical treatment to alter their sexual characteristics. They then wanted the Department of Home Affairs to alter their sex descriptions, right? So this whole case, someone records that each transgender spouse had undergone a treatment to alter their sexual characteristics after marriage, and then they sought legal recognition, right? And then they go to the Department of Home Affairs, and then the DHA creates serious difficulties, right? One of the problems was that the applicants were married under the Marriage Act, in which we know that in the Marriage Act, the marriage is between a man and a woman, historically so, right? And then Home Affairs seemed to think that if one spouse changed their sex description, the marriage could no longer remain under the Act, or that the couple might have to divorce or convert the marriage, right? Then the court rejected that approach. The court found that there was no legal rule preventing a married transgender person from applying for or obtaining an altered sex description, right? So in other words, being married under the Marriage Act did not block the person from the legal gender recognition. So a summary of this case, is that the respondents could not point out to any law prohibiting the processing and the approval of the applicants by transgender spouses, right? This case is extremely important because it connects administrative law, dignity, and equality, and the state cannot simply delay, refuse, or create extra requirements that are not in the act. Home Affairs must act lawfully and constitutionally. Imagine a person applies to Home Affairs to change their official sex description, and then the law says they may apply, but a Home Affairs official says no, because you are married. This is too complicated. Go and divorce first. The course case says that it is not acceptable unless the law requires it. Government officials cannot invent barriers that violate dignity. So the result, of course, is that transgender person married under the Marriage Act may still have their sex description altered. Their marriage does not automatically become invalid simply because one spouse transitions, right? So the development is this. Before 2003, and especially under the W versus W, the law was rigid and biological. Sex was treated as fixed at birth. And then after 2003 Act and GOS, the law became more constitutional and dignity-based, right? The law now recognizes that a person's official sex description can be altered, and state institutions must give effect to that recognition, right? So just for your own memory's sake, like when you're preparing for exams and all, you must know that W versus W equals to the old law, biological, fixed at birth approach, and then the Alteration Act, the 2003 Act, it's equals to this digital recognition of altered sex description, and then the GOS case. It's the one that comes with the constitutional enforcement of dignity, equality, and recognition, right? So let's just do a quick summary that you can possibly memorize or draft down, whatever, for your exams, right? So sex and gender affect status because they may influence how the law classifies and recognizes a person, right? However, under the Constitution, any differentiation based on sex and gender must comply with equality and dignity. The old case of W versus W reflected a narrow biological approach by treating sex as fixed at birth, even after the sex reassignment, right? So this position has since been transformed by the Alteration of Sex Description and Sex Status Act of 2000 and Act 43 of 49, sorry, please scratch that. Act 49 of 2003, which allows qualifying persons to alter their sex description officially. In GOS versus Minister of Home Affairs, the court confirmed that transgender persons, including those married under the Marriage Act, may obtain legal recognition of their altered sex description, and that Home Affairs may not impose unlawful barriers. The modern position is therefore constitutional, rights-based, and focused on dignity, equality, and proper legal recognition. So now, you must remember the GOS case. You must remember the W versus W case. It's very important, and you must remember the act. Okay? You must remember the Alteration of Sex Description and Sex Status Act of 2003. Okay, so it may have been going on too fast, but you can watch this over and over again. And then if you do have any questions, you can post them down below. If you're not subscribed to my YouTube channel and you think that it's helpful, in preparation of your classes or exams, hit the subscribe button and then you can join and become a member as well if you like. Okay. Um, Thank you so much for joining, and I will see you in the next series.